Welcome back to Prophecy Reformation Now in this segment, because history is so much a part of prophecy, as all God-given prophecy is history in advance. We're continuing our trek with James A. Wiley through The History of Protestantism. And today we'll pick up where we left off last time. Chapter 8, War of the Peasants. A new danger, German peasantry, their oppressions. These grow worse. The Reformation seeks to alleviate them. The outbreak, the Reformation accused. The 12 Articles, these rejected by the princes. Luther's course. His admonitions to the clergy and the peasantry. Rebellion at Pavia, extends to Franconia, etc. The Black Forest, peasant army, ravages, slaughterings. Count Louis of Helfenstein, extends to the Rhine. Universal terror, army of the princes, insurrection arrested. Weinsberg, retaliation. Thomas Munzer, Lessons of the Outbreak. The sun of the Reformation was mounting into the sky and promising to fill the world with its light. In a moment, a cloud gathered, overspread the firmament, and threatened to quench the young day in the darkness of a horrible night. The troubles that now arose had not been foreseen by Luther. That the Pope, whom the Reformation would despoil of the Triple Crown, with all the spiritual glory and temporal power attendant thereon, should anathematize it. That the Emperor, whose schemes of policy and ambition it thwarted, should make war against it, and that the numerous orders of the mitre and the cowl should swell the opposition, was to be expected. But that the people, from whose eyes it was to tear the bandage of spiritual darkness, and from whose arms it was to rend the fetters of temporal bondage, should seek to destroy it, had not entered into Luther's calculations. Yet now a terrible blow, the greatest the Reformation had as yet sustained, came upon it, not from the Pope, nor from the Emperor, but from the people. The oppressions of the German peasantry had been growing for centuries. They had long since been stripped of the rude privileges their fathers enjoyed. They could no longer roam their forests at will, kill what game they pleased, and build their hut on whatever spot taste or convenience dictated. Not only were they robbed of their ancient rights, they were compelled to submit to new and galling restrictions. Tied to their native acres, in many instances, they were compelled to expend their sweat in tilling the fields, and spill their blood in maintaining the quarrels of their masters. To temporal oppression was added ecclesiastical bondage. The small portion of earthly goods which the baron had left them, the priests wrung from them by spiritual threats, thus filling their cup of suffering to the brim. The power of contrast came to embitter their lot. While one part of Germany was sinking into drudgery and destitution, another part was rising into affluence and power. The free towns were making rapid strides in the acquisition of liberty, and their example taught the peasants the way to achieve a like independence. By combination, letters and arts were awakening thought and prompting to effort. Last of all came the Reformation, and that great power vastly widened the range of human vision by teaching the essential equality of all men, and weakening the central authority or keystone in the arch of Europe, namely the papacy. It was now evident to many that the hour had fully come when these wrongs, which dated from ancient times, but which had been greatly aggravated by recent events, must be redressed. The patience of the sufferers was exhausted. They had begun to feel their power, and if their fetters were not loosed by their masters, they would be broken by themselves. And with a blind rage and destructive fury, proportioned to the ignorance in which they had been kept, and the degradation into which they had been sunk, in the words of an eloquent writer and philosopher who flourished in a later age, they would break their chains on the heads of their oppressors. Mutterings of the gathering storm had already been heard. Premonitory insurrections and tumults had broken out in several of the German countries. The close of the preceding century had been marked by the revolt of the Boers in Holland, who paraded the country under a flag on which was blazoned a gigantic cheese. The 16th century opened amid similar disturbances. Every 2 or 3 years there came a new league, followed by a popular insurrection. These admonished the princes, civil and spiritual, that they had no alternative as regarded the future but reformation or revolution. Spires, Württemberg, Katharina, and Hungary were the successive theaters of these revolts, which all sprang from one cause: oppressive labor, burdens which were growing ever the heavier, and privileges which were waxing ever the narrower. The poor people, dehumanized by ignorance, knew but of one way of righting themselves: demolishing the castles, wasting the lands, spoiling the treasures, and in some instances slaying the persons of their oppressors. It was at this hour that the Reformation stepped upon the stage. It came with its healing virtue to change the hearts and tame the passions of men, and so to charm insurrectionary spirit which threatened to devastate the world. It accomplished its end so far. It would have accomplished it completely. It would have turned the hearts of the princes to their subjects, and the hearts of the people to their rulers, had it been suffered to diffuse itself freely among both classes. Even as it was, it brought with it a pause in the insurrectionary violence, which had begun to be common. But soon as its progress was arrested by force, and then it was accused by the author of those evils which it was not permitted to cure. "See," said Duke George of Saxony, "what an abyss Luther has opened. He has reviled the Pope. He has spoken evil of dignities. He has filled the minds of the people with lofty notions of their own importance, and by his doctrines he has sown the seeds of universal disorder and anarchy. Luther and his Reformation are the cause of the Peasant War." Many besides Duke George found it convenient to shut their eyes to their own misdeeds, and to make the gospel the scapegoat of calamities of which they themselves were the authors. Even Erasmus upbraided Luther thus: "We are now reaping the fruits of what you have sown." Some show of reason was given to these accusations by Thomas Munzer, who imported a religious element into this deplorable outbreak. Munzer was a professed disciple of the Reformation, but he held it to be unworthy of a Christian to be guided by any objective authority, even the Word of God. He was called to liberty, and the law or limit of that liberty was his own inward light. Luther, he affirmed, by instituting ordinances and forms, had established another popedom, and Munzer disliked the popedom of Wittenberg even more than he did the popedom of Rome. The political opinions of Munzer partook of a like freedom with his religious ones. To submit to princes was to serve Belials. We have no superior but God. The gospel taught that all men were equal, and this he interpreted, or rather misinterpreted, into the demonic doctrine of equality of rank and community of goods. "We must mortify the body," said he, by fasting in simple clothing, look gravely, speak little, and wear a long beard. These and such like things, said Sladen, he called the cross. Such was the man who, girding on the sword of Gideon, put himself at the head of the revolted peasantry. He inoculated them with his own visionary spirit, and taught them to aim at the liberty of which their own judgments or passions were the rule. The peasants put their demands, January 1525, into 12 articles. Considering the heated imaginations of those who penned them, these articles were reasonable and moderate. The insurgents craved restitution of certain free domains which had belonged to their ancestors, and certain rights of hunting and fishing which they themselves had enjoyed, but which had been taken from them. They demanded further a considerable mitigation of taxes, which burdened them heavily, and which were of comparatively recent imposition. They headed their claim of rights with the free choice of their ministers. And it was a further peculiarity of this document that each article in it was supported by a text from Scripture. An enlightened policy would have conceded these demands in the main. Wise rulers would have said, "Let us make these millions free of the earth, of the water, and of the forest, as their fathers were. From serfs let us convert them into free men. It is better that their skill should enrich, and their valor defend our territories, than that their blood should water them." Alas, there was not wisdom enough in the age to adopt such a course. Those on whom these claims were pressed said, "No," with their hands upon their sword. The vessel of the Reformation was now passing between the Scylla of established despotism and the Charybdis of popular lawlessness. It required rare skill to steer it aright. Shall Luther ally his movement with that of the peasantry? We can imagine him under some temptation to essay ruling the tempest, in the hope of directing its fury to the overthrow of a system which he regarded as the parent of all the oppressions and miseries that filled Christendom, and had brought on at last this mighty convulsion. One less spiritual in mind, and with less faith in the inherent vitalities of the Reformation, might have been seduced into linking his cause with this tempest. Luther shrank from such a course. He knew that to ally so holy a cause as the Reformation with a movement at best but political would be to profane it, and that to borrow the sword of men in its behalf was the sure way to forfeit the help of that mightier sword which alone could win such a battle. The Reformation had its own path and its own weapons, to which, if it adhered, would assuredly triumph in the end. It would correct all wrongs, would explode all errors, and pacify all feuds, but only by propagating its own principles and diffusing its own spirit among men. Luther, therefore, stood apart. But this enabled him all the more at the right moment to come in effectively between the oppressor and the oppressed, and to tell a little of the truth to both. Turning to the princes, he reminded them of the long course of tyranny which they and their fathers had exercised over the poor people. To the bishops he spoke yet more plainly. They had hidden the light of the gospel from the people. They had substituted cheats and fables for the doctrines of revelation. They had fettered men by unholy vows, and fleeced them by unrighteous impositions, and now they were reaping as they had sowed. To be angry at the peasants, he told them, was to be guilty of the folly of the man who vents his passions against the rod with which he is struck instead of the hand that wields it. The peasantry was but the instrument in the hand of God for their chastisement. Luther next addressed himself to the insurgents. He acknowledged that their complaints were not without cause, and thus he showed that he had a heart which could sympathize with them in their miseries. But he faithfully told them that they had taken the wrong course to remedy it. They would never mitigate their lot by rebellion. They must exercise Christian submission and wait the gradual but certain rectification of their individual wrongs and those of society at large by the divine healing power of the gospel. He sought to enforce his admonition by his own example. He had not taken the sword. He had relied on the sole instrumentality of the gospel, and they themselves knew how much it had done in a very few years to shake the power of an oppressive hierarchy, with the political despotism that upheld it, and to ameliorate the condition of Christendom. No army could have accomplished half the work in double the time. He implored them to permit this process to go on. It is preachers, not soldiers, the gospel, not rebellion, that is to benefit the world. And he warned them that if they should oppose the gospel in the name of the gospel, they would only rivet the yoke of their enemies upon their neck. The courage of the reformer is not less conspicuous than his wisdom. In speaking thus plainly to two such parties at such an hour, but Luther had but small thanks for his fidelity. The princes accused him of throwing his shield over the rebellion because he refused to pronounce an unqualified condemnation of the peasantry, and the peasants blamed him as truckling to the princes because he was not wholly with the insurrection. Posterity has judged otherwise. At this, as at every other crisis, Luther acted with profound moderation and wisdom. His mediation failed, however, and the storm now burst. The first insurrectionary cloud rolled up in Pavia, from beside the sources of the Danube. It made its appearance in the summer of 1524. The insurrectionary spirit ran like wildfire along the Danube, kindling the peasantry into revolt, and filling the towns with tumults, seditions, and terrors. By the end of the year, Thuringia, Franconia, and part of Saxony were in blaze. When the spring of 1525 opened, the conflagration spread wider still. It was now that the 12 articles, to which we have referenced above, were published, and became the standard for the insurgents to rally round. John Mueller, of Bolbenbach, traversed the region of the Black Forest, attired in a red gown and a red cap, preceded by the tricolor red, black, and white, and followed by a herald, who read aloud the 12 articles, and demanded the adherence of the inhabitants of the districts through which he passed. The peasant army that followed him was continually reinforced by new accessions. Towns too feeble to resist these formidable bands opened their gates at their approach, and not a few knights and barons, impelled by terror, joined their ranks. The excitement of the insurgents soon grew into fury. Their march was no longer tumultuous simply. It had now become destructive and desolating. The country in their rear resembled the track over which an invading and plundering host had passed. Fields were trampled down, barns and storehouses were rifled, the castles of the nobility were demolished, and the convents were burned to the ground. More cruel violence than these did this army of insurgents inflict. They now began to dye their path with the blood of unhappy victims. They slaughtered mercilessly those who fell into their power. On Easter Day, April 16, 1525, they surprised Weinsberg in Pavia. Its garrison they condemned to death. The fate of its commander, Count Louis of Helfenstein, was heartrending in the extreme. His wife, the natural daughter of Emperor Maximilian, threw herself at the feet of the insurgents, and holding her infant son in her arms, besought them, with a flood of tears, to spare her husband. It was in vain. They lowered their pikes and ran him through. He fell pierced by innumerable wounds. It seemed as if this conflagration was destined to rage till it had devoured all Christendom, as if the work of destruction would go on till all the fences of order were torn down and all the symbols of authority defaced, and pause in its career only when it had issued in a universal democracy, in which neither rank nor property would be recognized. It extended on the west to the Rhine, where it stirred into tumult the towns of Spires, Worms, and Cologne, and inflicted the Palatinate with its fever of sanguinary vengeance. It invaded Alsace and Lorraine. It convulsed Bavaria and Württemberg as far as the Tyrol. Its area extended from Saxony to the Alps. Bishops and nobles fled before it. The princes, taken by surprise, were without combination and without spirit, and, to use the language of Scripture, were chased as the rolling thing before the whirlwind. But soon they recovered from their stupor, and got together their forces. Albert, Count of Mansfeld, was the first to take to the field. He was joined with characteristic spirit and gallantry by Philip, Landgrave of Hesse, who was soon followed by John, Elector of Saxony, and Henry, Duke of Brunswick, all who joined their forces to oppose the rebel Boers. Had the matter rested with the Popish princes, the rebellion would have raged without resistance. On the 15th of May, 1525, the Confederate army came upon the rebel camp at Frankenhausen, where Munzer presided. Finding the rebels poorly armed and posted behind a miserable barricade of a few wagons, they sent a messenger with an offer of pardon on condition of laying down their arms. On Munzer's advice, the messenger was put to death. Both sides now prepared for battle. The leader of the peasant army, Munzer, addressed them in an enthusiastic and inflammatory harangue, bidding them not fear the army of tyrants they were about to engage, that the sword of the Lord and of Gideon would fight for them, and that they would this day experience a like miraculous deliverance as the Israelites at the Red Sea, as David when he encountered Goliath, and Jonathan when he attacked the garrison of the Philippines. Be not afraid, said he, of their great guns, for in my coat will catch all the bullets which they shall shoot at you. See ye not how gracious God is unto us? Lift up your eyes and see that rainbow in the clouds, for seeing we have the same painted on our banner. God plainly declares by that representation which he shows us from on high that he will stand by us in the battle, and that he will utterly destroy our enemies. Fall on them courageously. Despite this assurance of victory, the rebel host, at the first onset, fled in the utmost confusion. Munzer was among the first to make his escape. He took refuge in a house near the gate, where he was discovered after the battle, hid in the garret. He was committed to the custody of Duke George. In this encounter, 5,000 of the peasantry were slain, and thus the Confederates were at liberty to move their forces into Franconia, where the insurrection still raged with great fury. The insurgents here burned above 200 castles, besides noblemen's houses and monasteries. They took the town of Würzburg and besieged the castle. But Trushes, coming upon them, charged, discomfited, and put them to flight. Luther raised his voice again, but this time to pronounce an unqualified condemnation on a movement which, from a demand for just rights, had become a war of pillage and murder. He called on all to gird on the sword and resist it. The Confederate princes made George von Trusches general of their army, advancing by the side of the Lake of Constance and dividing his soldiers into 3 bodies. Trucius attacked the insurgents with vigor. Several battles were fought. Towns and fortresses were besieged. The peasantry contended with a furious bravery, knowing that they must conquer or endure a terrible revenge. But the arms of the princes triumphed. The campaign of this summer sufficed to suppress this formidable insurrection. But a terrible retaliation did the victors inflict upon the fanaticized hordes. They slaughtered them by tens of thousands on the battlefield. They cut them down as they fled. And not infrequently did they dispatch in cold blood those who had surrendered on promise of pardon. The lowest estimate of the number that perished is 50,000. Other accounts raise it to 100,000. When we consider the wide area over which the insurrection extended, and the carnage with which it was suppressed, we shall probably be of opinion that the latter estimate is nearer the truth. A memorable vengeance was inflicted on the Weinsberg, the scene of the death of Count Helfenstein. His murderers were apprehended and executed. The death of one of them was singularly tragic. He was tied to the stake with a chain that was long enough to permit him to run about. Trucius and other persons of quality then fetched wood, and strewing it all about, they kindled it into a cruel blaze. As the wretched man bounded wildly round and round amid the blazing faggots, the princes stood by and made sport of his tortures. The town itself was burned to the ground. Munzer, the ecclesiastical leader, who had fired the peasantry by harangues, by portents, by assurances that their enemies would be miraculously destroyed, and by undertaking to catch all the bullets in his sleeve, after witnessing the failure of his enterprise, was taken and decapitated. Prior to execution, he was taken before George, Duke of Saxony, and Landgrave Philip. On being asked why he had misled so many poor people to their ruin, he replied that he had done only his duty. The Landgrave was at pains to show him that sedition and rebellion are forbidden in the Scriptures, and that Christians are not at liberty to avenge their wrongs by their own private authority. To this he was silent. On the rack he shrieked and laughed by turns, and when about to die he openly acknowledged his error and crimes. By way of example, his head was stuck upon a pole in the open fields. Such horrible ending had the insurrection of the peasants. Ghastly memorials marked the provinces where this tempest had passed. Fields wasted, cities overturned, castles and dwellings in ruins, and, more piteously still, corpses dangling from the trees or gathered in heaps in the fields. The gate remained with Rome. The old worship was in some places restored, and the yoke of feudal bondage was more firmly riveted than before upon the necks of the people. Nevertheless, the outbreak taught great lessons to the world, worth 100-fold all the sufferings endured, if only they had been laid to heart. The Peasant War illustrated the Protestant movement by showing how widely it differed from Romanism, in both its origin and its issues. The insurrection did not manifest itself, or in but the mildest type, at Wittenberg and in the places permeated by the Wittenberg movement. When it touched ground which the Reformation had occupied, it became that instant powerless. It lacked air to fan it on. It found no longer inflammable materials to kindle it into a blaze. The gospel said to this wasting conflagration, "Thus far, but no farther." Could any man doubt that if Bavaria and the neighboring provinces had been in the same condition with Saxony, there would have been no peasant war? This outbreak taught the age, moreover, that Protestantism could no more be advanced by popular violence than it could be suppressed by aristocratic tyranny. It was independent of both. It must advance by its own inherent might, along its own path. In fine, this terrible outbreak gave timely warning to the world of what the consequences would be of suppressing the Reformation. It showed that underneath the surface of Christendom there was an abyss of evil principles and fiendish passions, which would one day break through and rend society in pieces, unless they were extinguished by a divine influence. Munzer and his inward light was but the precursor of Voltaire and the Illuminati of his school. The Peasants' War of 1525 was the first opening of the fountains of the great deep. The Terror was first seen stalking through Germany. It slumbered for 2 centuries while the religious and political powers of Europe was undergoing a process of slow emasculation. Then the Terror again awoke, and the blasphemies, massacres, and wars of the French Revolution overwhelmed Europe. Wow, what good insight. Chapter 9. The Battle of Pavia and its influence on Protestantism. The papacy entangles itself with earthly interest. Protestantism stands alone. Monarchy and the popedom. Which is to rule? The conflict a defense to Protestantism. War between the Emperor and Francis I. Expulsion of the French from Italy. Battle of Pavia. Capture and captivity of Francis I. Charles V at the head of Europe. Protestantism to be extirpated. Luther marries. The nuns of Mims. Catherine von Bora. Antichrist about to be born. What Luther's marriage said to Rome. There was one obvious difference between that movement of which Rome was the headquarters and that of which Wittenberg was the center. The popedom mixed itself up with the politics of Europe. Protestantism, on the other hand, stood apart and refused to ally itself with earthly confederacies. The consequence was that the papacy had to shape its course to suit the will of those on whom it leaned. It rose and fell with the interests with which it had cast in its lot. The loss of a battle or the fall of a statesman would, at times, bring it to the brink of ruin. Protestantism, on the other hand, was free to hold its own course and to develop its own principles. The fall of monarchs and the changes in the political world gave it no uneasiness. Instead of fixing its gaze on the troubled ocean around it, its eye was lifted to heaven. At this hour, intrigues, ambitions, and wars were rife all round Protestantism. The kings of Spain and France were striving with one another for the possessions of Italy. The Pope taught, of course, that he had a better right than either to be master of that country. He was jealous of both monarchs, and shaped his policy so as to make the power of the one balance and check that of the other. He hoped to be able one day to drive both out of the peninsula, if not by arms, yet by arts. But till that day should come, his safety lay in appearing to be the friend of both, and in taking care that the one should not be very much stronger than the other. All three, the Emperor, the King of France, and the Pope, in whatever else they differed, were the enemies of the Reformation. And had they united their arms, they would have been strong enough, in all reckoning of human chances, to put down the Protestant movement. But their dynastic ambitions, fomented largely by the personal piques and crafts and ambitious projects of the men around them, kept them at almost perpetual feud. Each aspired to be the first man of his time. The Pope was still dreaming of restoring to the Papal See the supremacy which it possessed in the days of Gregory VII and Innocent III, and of dictating to both Charles and Francis. These sovereigns, on the other hand, were determined not to let go the superiority of which they had at last achieved over the tiara, the struggle of monarchy to keep what it had got, of the tiara to regain what it had lost, and of all three to be uppermost, filled their lives with disquiet, their kingdoms with misery, and their age with war. But these rivalries were a wall of defense around that divine principle which was growing up into majestic stature, and a world shaken by the many furious storms that were raging on it. Scarce had the young Emperor Charles thrown down the gauge of battle to Protestantism when these tempests broke in from many quarters. He had just fulminated the edict which consigned Luther to destruction, and was drawing his sword to execute it, when a quarrel broke out between himself and Francis I. The French army, crossing the Pyrenees, overran Navarre and entered Castile. The emperor hastened back to Spain to take measures for the defense of his kingdom. The war thus begun lasted till 1524, and ended in the expulsion of the French from Milan and Genoa, where they had been powerful ever since the days of Charles VIII. Nor did hostilities end there. The emperor, indignant at the invasion of his kingdom, and wishing to chastise his rival on his own soil, sent his army into France. The chivalry of Francis I and the patriotic valor of his subjects drove back the invaders. But the French king, not content with having rid himself of the soldiers of Spain, would chastise the emperor in his turn. He followed the Spanish army into Italy, and sought to recover the cities and provinces whereof he had recently been despoiled, and which were all the dearer to him that they were situated in a land to which he was ever exceedingly desirous of stretching his scepter, but from which he was so often compelled, to his humiliation, again to draw it back. The winter of 1525 beheld the Spanish and French armies face to face under the walls of Pavia. The palace was strongly fortified, and had held out against the French for now 2 months, although Francis I had employed in its reduction all the engineering expedients known to the age. Despite the obstinacy of the defenders, it was now evident that the town must fall. The Spanish garrison, reduced to extremity, sallied forth and joined battle with the besiegers with all the energy of despair. This day was destined to bring with it a terrible reverse in the fortunes of Francis I. Its dawn saw him the first warrior of his age. Its evening found him in the abject condition of a captive. His army was defeated under the walls of that city which they had been on the point of entering as conquerors. 10,000, including many a gallant knight, lay dead on the field, and the misfortune was crowned by the capture of the king himself, who was taken prisoner in battle and carried to Madrid as a trophy of the conqueror. In Spain, Francis I dragged out a wretched year in captivity. The emperor, elated by his good fortune, and desirous not only of humiliating his royal prisoner, but of depriving him of the power of injuring him in time to come, imposed very hard conditions of ransom. These the French king readily subscribed, and all the more so that he had not the slightest intention of fulfilling them. In the treaty of peace, it is stipulated, among other things, says Sladen, that the emperor and king shall endeavor to extirpate the enemies of the Christian religion, and the heresies of the sect of the Lutherans. In like manner, that peace being made betwixt them, they should settle the affairs of the public and make war against the Turk and heretics excommunicated by the Church. For that it was above all things necessary, and that the Pope had often solicited and advised them to bestir themselves therein. That therefore, in compliance with his desires, they resolved to entreat him that he would appoint a certain day when the ambassadors and deputies of all kings and princes might meet, in a convenient place, with full power and commission to treat of such measures as might seem proper for undertaking a war against the Turk, and also for rooting out heretics and the enemies of the Church. The other articles were added of a very rigorous kind, such as that the French king should surrender Burgundy to the emperor, and renounce all pretensions to Italy, and deliver up his 2 eldest sons as hostages for the fulfillment of the stipulations. Having signed the treaty early in 1526, Francis was set at liberty. Crossing the frontier near Iron, and touching French soil once more, he waved his cap in the air, and shouting aloud, "I am yet a king," he put spurs to his Turkish horse, and galloped along the road to St. Jean de Luz, where his courtiers waited to welcome him. The hour was now come, so Charles V thought, when he could deal his long meditated blow against the Wittenberg heresy. Never since he ascended the throne had he been so much at liberty to pursue the policy to which his wishes prompted. The Battle of Pavia had brought the war in Italy to a more prosperous issue than he had dared to hope. France was no longer a thorn in his side. Its monarch, formerly a rival, he had now converted into his ally, or rather, as Charles doubtless believed, into his lieutenant, bound to aid him in his enterprises, and especially in that one that lay nearer his heart than any other. Moreover, the emperor was on excellent terms with the King of England, and it was in the interest of the English minister, Cardinal Wolsey, who cherished hopes of the tiara through the powerful influence of Charles, that good understanding should continue. As regarded Pope Clement, the emperor was on the point of visiting Rome to receive the imperial crown from the pontiff's hand, and in addition, doubtless, the apostolic benediction on the enterprise which Charles had in view against an enemy that Clement abhorred more than he did the Turk. This was a most favorable juncture for prosecuting the battle of the papacy. The victory of Pavia had left Charles the most puissant monarch in Europe. On all sides was peace, and having vanquished so many foes, surely it would be no difficult matter to extinguish the monk who had neither sword nor buckler to defend him. Accordingly, Charles now took the first step toward the execution of his design. Sitting down, May 24, 1525, in the stately Alcazar of Toledo, whose rocky foundations are washed by the Tagus, he indited his summons to the princes and states of Germany to meet at Augsburg to take measures to defend the Christian religion and the holy rites and customs received from their ancestors, and to prohibit all pernicious doctrines and innovations. This edict the emperor supplemented by instructions from Seville, dated March 23, 1526, which, in effect, enjoined the princes to see to the execution of the Edict of Worms. Every hour the tempest that was gathering over Protestantism grew darker. If at no previous period had the emperor been stronger, or his sword been so free to execute his purpose, at no time had Luther been so defenseless as now. His protector, the Elector Frederick, whose circumspection approached timidity, but whose purpose was ever resolute and steady, was now dead. The three princes who stood up in his room, the Elector John, Philip Landgrave of Hesse, and Albert of Prussia, were new to the cause. They lacked the influence which Frederick possessed. They were discouraged, almost dismayed, by the thickening dangers. Germany divided, the Ratisbon League rampant, and the author of the Edict of Worms, placed by the unlooked-for victory of Pavia at the head of Europe. The only man who did not tremble was Luther. Not that he did not see the formidable extent of the danger, but because he was able to realize a defender whom others could not see. He knew that if the gospel had been stripped of all earthly defense, it was not because it was about to perish, but because a divine hand was about to be stretched out in its behalf, so visibly as to give proof to the world that it had a protector, though unseen, more powerful than all its enemies, while dreadful fulminations were coming from the other side of the Alps, and while angry and mortal menaces were being hourly uttered in Germany. What did Luther do? Run to his cell and do penance in sackcloth and ashes to turn away the ire of the emperor and pontiff? No. Taking Catherine von Bora by the hand, he led her to the altar and made her his wife. Catherine von Bora was the daughter of one of the minor nobles of the Saxon Palatinate. Her father's fortune was not equal to his rank, and this circumstance disabling him from giving Catherine a dowry, he placed her in the convent of Nimptsch, near Grimma, in Saxony, along with the 8 nuns who were the companions of her seclusion. She studied the Scriptures, and from them the sisters came to see their vow was not binding. The Word of God had unbarred the door of their cell. The 9 nuns, leaving the convent in a body, repaired to Wittenberg, and were there maintained by the bounty of the Elector, administered through Luther. In process of time, all the nuns found husbands, and Kate alone of the 9 remained unmarried. The reformer thus had opportunity of knowing her character and virtues, and appreciating the many accomplishments which were more rarely the ornament of the feminine intellect in those days than they are in ours. The marriage took place on the 11th of June. On the evening of that day, Luther, accompanied by the pastor Pomeranus, whom he had asked to bless the union, repaired to the house of the burgomaster, who had been constituted Kate's guardian, and there, in the presence of 2 witnesses, the great painter, Lucas Cranach, and Dr. John Appella, the marriage took place. On the 15th of June, Luther says, in a letter to Rule, I have made the determination to retain nothing of my episcopal life, and thus I have entered the state of matrimony, at the urgent solicitation of my father. The special purport of the letter was to invite Rule to the marriage feast, which was to be given on Tuesday, the 27th of June. The old couple from Mansfield, John and Margaret Luther, were to be present. Rule was wealthy, and Luther, with characteristic frankness, tells him that any present he might choose to bring with him would be acceptable. Wenceslaus Link of Nuremberg, whose nuptials Luther had blessed some time before, was also invited, but, being poor, it was stipulated that he should bring no present. Spalatin was to send some venison, and come himself. Amsdorff also was of the number of the guests. Philip Melanchthon, the dearest friend of all, was absent. We can guess the reason. The bold step of Luther had staggered him. To marry while so many calamities were impended. Philip went about some days with anxious and clouded face, but when the clamor arose, his brow cleared, his eye brightened, and he became the warmest defender of the marriage of the Reformer, in which he was joined by not a few wise and moderate men in the Romish Church. The union had hardly effected when, as we have already hinted, a shout of indignation arose, as if Luther had done some impious and horrible thing. "It is incest," exclaimed Henry VIII of England. "From this marriage will spring Antichrist." And others, remembering the terror that some nameless astrologer of the Middle Ages had foretold, that Antichrist would be the issue of a perjured nun and an apostate monk. "How many Antichrists," said Erasmus, with that covert but trenchant irony in which he was so great a master, "how many Antichrists must there be then in the world already?" What was Luther's crime? He had obeyed an ordinance which God had instituted. He had entered into a state which an apostle had pronounced honorable in all. But he did not heed the noise. It was his way of saying to Rome, "Thus is the obedience I give to your ordinances, and this is the awe in which I stand of your threatening." The rebuke thus tacitly given sank deep. It was another inexpiable offense, added to the many former ones, for which, as Rome fondly believed, the hour of recompense was now drawing nigh. Even some of the disciples of the Reformation were scandalized at Luther's marrying an ex-nun. So slow are men to cast off the trammels of ages. With Catherine Bora, there entered a new light into the dwelling of Luther. To sweetness and modesty she added a more than ordinary share of good sense, a genuine disciple of the gospel. She became the faithful companion and helpmeet of the Reformer in all the labors and trials of his subsequent life. From the inner circle of that serenity and peace which her presence diffused around him, he looked forth upon a raging world which was continually seeking to destroy him, and which marveled that the Reformer did not sink, not seeing the hand that turned aside the blows which were being ceaselessly aimed at him.